Good morning and welcome to Improving's panel discussion on business transformation and agility. I'm Devlin Lyles. I'm the president of Improving's Houston office, and I'll be host and moderator for today. We'll be asking questions of each of our panelists and would encourage you to do so as well. In the QA feature on the side of the screen, you can submit a question. A list of those will be showing up as our kind of background producer, Max Day, makes those available. We'll be using a mixture of prepared questions as well as those from the audience. Now to introduce our panel, joining me are some great thought leaders in the Agile space today. We have Allison Pollard, an international presenter, coach, and mentor in Agile practices, helping leaders to kind of break the status quo. Vimal Pillai, Agile Coaching consultant here in Houston. Vimal's passion for sharing knowledge about agility has led him to authoring a series of articles on business agility in collaboration with other improvers that became the impetus for today's talk. Chris Wickett, principal consultant out of our Improving Twin Cities office, with years of hands-on experience in guiding large companies through Agile and business transformations. And then Don McGreal. Don McGreal is the VP of Learning Solutions at Improving and co-author of the best-selling book, The Professional Product Owner, Leveraging Scrum as a Competitive Advantage. He's a global trainer, co-founder of Tasty Cupcakes, a comprehensive collection of games and exercises for helping to accelerate an Agile adoption and the adoption of Agile principles. Welcome to each of you. Glad you were able to join us today, and thank you. We're going to kind of dive in and get started. So while none of us have a crystal ball, something we often get asked, and I'm sure you've all heard, is, hey, what's other industries doing? Where are we seeing big investments in business agility? Where are you seeing things move to? Don, I'd like to start with you. Where are you seeing those big investments?
We're seeing it all over now. I think our top two Agile, transformation or adoption clients are not even IT, right? So we're seeing it in lots of different businesses. And when we first started doing this 12, 13 years ago, we first started working with organizations going more Agile. It was always on the IT side. That's kind of what we did. Mm-hmm. And admittedly, back then it was, they were mad at us for not getting things done on time. And it was like budget and time and scope focused. And that's what we were honestly doing it for. And I remember once there was a client back in Columbus, about 2012, we were training their IT groups. And then a year later, they came back and said, hey, we've gotten so good at this stuff that the bottleneck now isn't with us, it's with the marketing group feeding us things. Do you think you could do this for them? And our attitude was, I don't know, we could, I'm totally willing to try as long as we're open and saying, we could explain how we do it over in IT. If this applies, great. If not, and so we did it. We did a workshop with them. We helped them organize their work, and it worked. And then later on, another client did it with an HR department, an insurance company in Minneapolis, and it kind of worked there too. And so we started moving into these different parts of industry and businesses. If I had to boil it down, there's the organizations where their products don't change that much. It's like the financial ones, the banks and stuff like that. But what they realize is they want a lot of competition from the channel side, like their technologies for accessing their products, like mobile apps and new ways of getting access to their accounts and stuff like that. And we're seeing there's a lot of investment there in the actual channels for that. They're realizing they're more software companies than they are financial companies now. And then there's ones that are looking for just new ways of innovating, like our energy companies and stuff like that we work in. So when there's a lot of change needed, that's where we're seeing it. We're seeing it all over in lots of different business places. So we've kind of stumbled into it, and now it's just kind of grown over all these years.
Definitely makes sense. I saw Vimal kind of nodding and smiling. So you're working in one of the industries that Don just mentioned. Where are you seeing this in the energy space?
Yeah, I mean, really what Don was saying resonated with me because it's exactly what we're seeing, as you mentioned, Devlin, in the energy industry, where maybe the transformation starts in the software, the IT space, and then other areas of the business get wind of it and say, hey, we want to get on some of that too, right? And I think the interesting piece is, as the world has evolved, as businesses are looking to be more competitive and operate in faster, leaner ways, some of the same principles of agility still apply, right? I mean, self-organizing teams, being able to respond to change quickly, right? Even if you're an HR department, you're probably using some type of software tool today, or you're probably trying to find ways to operate quicker, better, faster, more efficient. A lot of times when we work with some of these teams in other areas of the business that are not, IT related, they're not as accustomed to responding to change very quickly because what they've done may have been working for a long time, right? And I think that the ease of change and the cost of change has gotten lower to where the principles of agility kind of apply. And so we oftentimes see in some of those areas that there is a huge investment in that space in reorganizing teams to be more cross-functional, right? Breaking down some of those barriers, or in different investments into how we organize product goals or team goals and things like that, and then allow teams to self-organize or self-manage that goal itself. So it's interesting to kind of see where, to Don's point, I mean, we maybe started off as like, oh, this is interesting. Yeah, we're happy to help. But now you can see as businesses and as leaders are catching up to that mindset, it's just becoming more and more prevalent in the broader space of business agility.
Now we're like, it'll totally work.
Yeah, well, and Vimal, you mentioned, you mentioned HR, and that's definitely an area I'm hearing more about from some of my clients of how can the HR team better think about, say, like the candidate experience for hiring, and how can we make that as short as possible so that when we find that talented person, we get an offer in their hands and we don't lose them to someone else. So we're bringing in some Kanban, we're bringing in some design thinking into those areas. And it's been pretty exciting to see how they apply it, how they use it, because it doesn't mean that they're changing their software necessarily, it's changing their processes and how they interact with people. The other big area that I've noticed, and I know Chris and I have talked about this one an awful lot, innovation. So many companies last year with the pandemic really pulled back and focused on shorter term investments. And now that things are starting to recover, they're again looking at what might be those disruptive ideas that have a longer horizon that, in a couple of years from now could be a really big game changer. So I'll pass it over to Chris to talk a little bit more about what she's seen in that space too.
Yeah, so speaking of disrupted ideas, transforming PMOs. That I think if we could invest more, I'm seeing more of that. And Allison, like you mentioned, that innovation and figuring out what do we want to be when we grow up kind of thing. And I think if folks can really take a look at it holistically of what it takes to be agile, as we all know, in their business, I think that is a big plus. And that's where the investments that we've had on the IT side, but if we can really dig in and transform those PMOs and get more of that, what are we wanting to invest in, doing those experiments, that would be huge. So I think that again is an area of that, the newer investment area.
Fantastic. So you guys kind of hit on a broad spread from marketing to HR to PMOs to IT to all of these pieces. And I've often heard no two business agility or agile transformations, agile adoptions ever look the same. But we see some great success and we see it repeatedly across industry and across groups. What do you feel is driving those core success factors in those transformations? Like, is there something you point at and you go, if we have this, everything else gets easier? Chris, where do you see that? Like, what's one of the, if we have this one?
I would say real engagement and commitment from the leadership and the whole organization to be a learning organization and be willing to try different things and, have an expectation that we are ever evolving. We're never finished with our journey. And while that can sound daunting to some effect, brings in kind of what Allison was mentioning, that innovation. Where a lot of us in the IT world, especially, but on the business too, we love to invent things and have good design and so on. So if we can have that real engagement and put all of that effort to what our organization wants to be, I think that adds a lot of value. So leadership, team level, everyone wanting to really be committed to embracing change and embracing that learning journey.
You hit on learning, and I've got to go to Don because like that's his ballgame. Like, what's one of those core factors, Don?
Yeah, Chris mentioned some good ones there. The one I keep going back to, and this is kind of my product owner roots a little bit, is the thing I use to motivate teams as much as possible was just to get them to meet the people whose lives they're impacting, right? And the more we could focus on who our customer is, a lot of like these, whether you're doing daily meetings correctly or you've got a lot of that stuff kind of goes by the wayside. As long as you understand we're impacting people's lives here, and we're focusing on value. So if we can just as quickly as possible find a way to get something out the door into their hands, rather than these huge long initiatives that take 12 to 18 months, and you don't ever know if you'll ever get a return on that investment from a business perspective. So we can like test the market out, put things out there, and fail a bunch of times and just learn and get that face time from the people doing the work to the people getting value from the work. I think that's where things just fall into place. We start to make the right decisions, and we see these frameworks that are in place in the Agile world. They seem to make more sense of why we're doing it. If we only focus on the frameworks and like just saying, okay, you have to do these meetings and play these roles and do this, that's where I think the biggest failure is. People just don't tend to see why. Like, well, okay, why are we doing this again? Why are we standing up for 15 minutes every day? So that's the first thing we try to do, is like, okay, how we know this is going to be successful? What are we going to, whose lives are going to impact? Who are they? Can we meet them? Can we sit down and watch them, use the things that we're building? That's to me, I know it's easier said than done, but that's that's the key thing for me.
That makes sense. Allison and Vimal, anything to add to those? What's the core pieces that may not have been mentioned yet?
There's so much goodness on what Chris and Dawn have both said. And I think it's building up that capability to listen within the organization. How do the leaders listen to their teams? How do we all listen to our customers? How do we listen to, what our business metrics are telling us too? Like we might be serving real humans and giving them great things as customers, but if it's not viable for our business, if it's not something that we're able to sustain, that's not going to be good for them either in the long term. So it's, how do we set up the right amount of transparency and the right connection between people and between these, different dashboards that we might create, or like other like probes into the market that we're able to make sense of that and be able to respond to it well.
Yeah, I think just building on that and tying back to Chris, I think, a lot of what you mentioned just ties into just the mindset, right, that you expect to see or hope to see from an organization. And maybe it's overly simplifying it to say like that core, that core piece is just a mindset across the company. But I think oftentimes when you see transformations, especially large scale transformations it might start as, maybe like a pilot with a couple of teams, almost as a grassroots movement sort of thing. And, there may or may not be a lot of success, and we see how it's affected the business and outcomes, quicker profits, save time and efficiencies and all that. And then the critical mass starts and it starts to grow within the company. And then one of the risks that happens is that mindset shift, and we have setbacks, and those setbacks tend to affect mindset, and it becomes more of a let's check off the Agile checkbox versus let's continue that, that mindset of continuous growth, innovation, knowing there's going to be setbacks. And I think that's where leaders have such an important factor or an important role in being able to say, like, yes, things are, even if we are doing every single Scrum event perfectly, it may not mean that we're achieving all the outcomes that we want. So I think that mindset of being able to continuously evolve, continuously approach and evaluate how are we actually tying what we're doing to the business outcomes that we're looking to accomplish, and keep kind of pushing in that direction, I think is so important.
So you hit on something that I want to dig into a little bit more there. The Agile checkbox, right? The Agile rubber stamp. As you get a broader adoption, and it went from I'm doing this because I believe in it to I'm doing this because I was told to. Right about that same kind of explosion of involvement, you also see a lot of things that aren't really covered by the Scrum guide, aren't really covered by some of the other kind of guidance and literature and those kind of things. You see product managers, and you see Agile PMs and Agile procurement, and all of these things get the Agile word kind of put in front of them. Now those roles are emerging from the adoption of the values and the principles, but how do we approach that evolution of an organization to trying to match up kind of Agile to all of these role changes that are happening there? I know, Allison, this is a space you've dug deeply into in the last few years. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've been getting more and more into org design and, learning some of the models and the tools, from that side of change. And it's been really exciting because roles are so often equated to like the boxes, of an org chart and who's going to report to who, or that checkbox list of here are the responsibilities. But when you're in an organization and you start hearing people ask about, what is my role now? What am I accountable for? You're looking at, what's trying to happen here? How is it that we're trying to work together, and who needs to own what and who needs to collaborate with who, is the first surface level of it. But then as you start to hear more hot spots kind of emerge, I think of an example years ago where I was brought in to help facilitate a workshop on this with a team. And part of the conflict was who schedules the calendar invite and gets the conference room. There is no checklist that is probably going to go down to the level of detail of who sends out the Outlook calendar invite and is supposed to get the conference room. But you could tell that, for the main people, it was I thought it was you, or no, I thought it was you. They were feeling as though they were being told to be the admin, and that they didn't.
Why isn't there an agile scheduler role in Scrum?
Yeah, they didn't feel respected, having this thrust upon them. And so we really had to dig more into the trust and try to make explicit how is it that you support the team, and what needs to happen with this particular group, and how do you want to handle these tasks amongst yourselves, because that's certainly not an area for a new Agile Center of Excellence to say from now on the tallest person in the room is the one that must schedule it. It just doesn't make sense, applied with that broad of a brush.
I'm totally picturing org charts organized by height of individual.
Yeah.
I know, yeah. And I'm super short, so I don't know what that just did to me.
Yeah, that doesn't bode well for me either, yeah.
So Vimal, I know you and I have had conversations about how this is showing up, and that kind of, I think we talked about the frozen middle, right? The people who are typically looking at an org change like this and going, wait, where do I fit? Kind of, how has that evolution been for you, and kind of being in that middle and helping them to guide out of it?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, an example even from where I'm currently working right now with our client, where we have a software program actually, and there's a number of these different roles. There's a product manager, somebody called a toolkit lead, these numerous different roles that are kind of a leftover from a previous world. And what we find is when, Don, you mentioned earlier about, meet the people and meet those end users where we're actually delivering the value. I think oftentimes where we lose connection there is if those roles become a little bit more like reporting, hierarchical, managerial roles, and then we tend to forget about how can we actually be leaders who are in service of the team, right? In service of the team, helping be an enabler for them to better deliver value, right? If they're, for example, the team that I was working in was actually building, risk and operational safety products for large offshore wells, right? It's a very high value area of the organization and has some really important safety critical pieces to it, right? And I think a lot of those leaders come from experience of having lots of in-depth business knowledge around that, and in service of the team and what they're trying to accomplish, probably could provide a lot of great context and feedback to the product. And I think that's where some of these roles, as they come up, yes, they might have certain responsibilities within them, but I think the important, again, touching back on mindset at the end of the day, is as those roles start evolving and as they might be kind of delegating different pieces of the many different moving areas of an agile team, it's almost like, well, how can we continue to make sure that what they're doing is in service of what the team or what the users are trying to accomplish?
Mm-hmm. We've seen these things blow up when we alienate those roles too, right?
Yeah.
So just because you have project manager in your title, if it comes across as, well, there's no project management in Scrum or in Agile or anything like that, I mean, you're alienating some pretty important people in an organization. And we've seen it where it was an uprising against the whole movement, and it didn't get anywhere because of that. And I think we've got to be a lot more pragmatic about it. I mean, I don't really care about changing people's titles that much, right?
That's where I was going to go too. Exactly that.
Let's think of these as roles, or like the latest Scrum guy doesn't even use the word roles. It's accountability. So who's going to have the product owner accountability? If you already have a product manager role, that sounds like, or title, or in your organization, could they have the product owner accountabilities? Would this business analyst be able to own those accountabilities? Could this project manager own the accountabilities of a Scrum Master? I really don't care about the title. I care more about their attitude and their internal agility as well. So I think we do a disservice sometimes when we go out there and start saying, no more, the word manager doesn't exist anywhere, or let's treat them as there should be somebody accountable for certain things in Scrum and in a lot of different applications. And let's not try to change everybody, the whole hierarchy necessarily. Maybe it'll happen, but I think we lose when we start that way.
Yeah.
This seems very tightly bound to what you were talking about, Chris, with the kind of agile PMO and the PMO transformation.
Exactly. And I think you guys just nailed it. It really goes back into what motivates us. And we go back into autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And separating those HR titles from the roles and figuring out how can we figure out what's the right thing to do to contribute to delivering that value. And I think that's that bigger deal. And that way your title can stay the same, but if you go back, like you say, Don, to that accountability, then the organization can continue to evolve and can continue to figure out what's the best way to be lean and deliver that value to the customer. And again, that mastery, autonomy, and purpose, that's a big deal. Very big deal.
So I have a follow-up question, and I'll kind of pivot this around the table, because we've hit on something here that it's always felt a little odd even when I was writing software for our clients and helping them through some of this, is I never had a good answer of my job gives me a lot of pride. It gives me a lot of purpose, my title, my experience, the value I bring to my company. It's a very personal thing for a lot of people, myself included. And when a program comes along and it says, yeah, you don't fit in one of these 4 places, it's almost like a judgment to me. Mm-hmm. How do we keep organizations from falling into that pit? Because that's a deep pit that can, to Don's point, kill an agile adoption. So Chris, how have you seen that play out? I mean, you've led massive organizations through that problem.
Yeah, and I think it is finding your passion, if you will, and especially leaders. This is where you want to help them develop their next skill set, if you will, or figure out maybe they didn't know that they wanted to get into training and so on. So it is opening. I'll go back to my saying, the world is their oyster. And what do you want to do? And not be a victim into this, but be very engaged and figure out what do you want to do with your next set of, I always say Chris 3.0, Chris 4.0, whatever, and embrace that journey so that you don't feel like you are, blocked in a corner and you can't do anything. And I think that's an opportunity to really be proactive at what you're contributing to that bigger purpose.
Definitely makes sense. Don, you mentioned you saw this go sideways and it killed an adoption. Was there a step that we could have stopped? We could have, as a group in that organization, gone, we can turn right here, but if we go any further, we're done.
Yeah, and more specifically, what had happened was, it's like it was that attitude of, well, if you're a project manager, you can't be a Scrum Master. You can't. That was the thing. So who was going to be the Scrum Master? And ultimately, what it turned into was, hey, team, you need a Scrum Master, and it was like the last person to say not it ended up being the Scrum Master, or like, what does anyone know what that guy does? Maybe they can. Don't want the busy people being Scrum Masters, like, because they got actual work to do. And so it ended up with this situation where the Scrum Masters didn't feel like they had a whole lot of authority or say anything. They became like the secretaries for the teams, right? Just like there's a block and they were just doing things, so putting up fancy boards and stuff like that. And unfortunately, that was just the way it happened. And then this company went through some cutbacks. They had to do a mandatory workforce reduction of 10%, 15%, something like that. And then guess who got the axe? And what they said, hey, we're used to Scrum now. We're pretty good at it. So maybe they don't need Scrum Masters anymore, right? Because if you just see the Scrum Master role as just the one that like kind of sets everything up and facilitates, well, now they know how to do it, right? They know how to do this. You guys are okay, right? And then they're the ones that left. So pretty much every Scrum Master was gone. And so, that's it. Whereas what I'd much prefer some of the best servant leaders I've ever worked with were project managers. They had the attitude. I don't care about the title again.
Right.
They're the ones that just knew that the best way to work with people is to do it in service. And if they had become the Scrum Masters, and it's easier to me to teach servant leadership than to teach somebody who doesn't have any leadership experience how to be a Scrum Master, right? To get that. So anyways, that would have been the turning point, is invite them in rather than alienate.
I think you hit on something beautiful there, which is, we've been a PMI partner for years, and some of the best Agilists I know were the project managers doing it very well. Because when you look at like CMMI Level 5, right, that's similar in a lot of aspects to continuous improvement, to the Agile stuff. Like, it gets a bad rap, I think, from the whole Scrum versus waterfall process wars of the late 90s, but there's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah.
So the late 90s, the early 2000s were kind of those formative years for the whole Agile and process space, especially in IT and software development, right? And so we saw Scrum kind of emerge in dominance it was the de facto answer in the last kind of 5 to 10 years. Is Scrum's kind of the default unless you have a different reason to go somewhere else. Do we see that continuing now that it's kind of flying outside of the IT space? Do we see it evolving? Do we see changes coming in that? Where's the evolution, right? The empirical processes that it's all built on means there's going to be some next level of gain. What's that next level that we're seeing? Kind of start out with you on this one, Vimal. Where are you seeing it on the ground? Like, what's that next thing?
That's a great question. I always kind of think about that myself, right? Or at some point, is Scrum going to be the old thing? Or are we going to move on to some new, shinier, framework or something like that that's going to be the biggest thing in the business? And I think through my experience so far, I've seen a couple of things. I think, there's always that, well, let me break this up in two pieces. I think, for one, Scrum is a fairly lightweight framework. I think that really, there's always that people have probably heard the saying that it exposes your problems, it doesn't solve your problems. And I think in some respect in transformations, when as I mentioned earlier, with some of those kind of grassroots, very, intro pilot team level things, you start seeing, okay, through the lightweight framework of Scrum, we start seeing a lot of progress. We start seeing larger organizational conflicts or challenges start to emerge. And I think that actually, if you look at even the Scrum framework over time, it's evolved quite a bit. And I think in this last year with the latest Scrum guide has been probably one of the most significant, changes and significant evidences of it evolving to, things like, self-managing teams versus self-organizing teams, a leader who serves. There's like lots of just different little nuances that speak to how Scrum, as we kind of started this conversation with, has almost kind of leaked over into lots of areas of business agility, not just software agility. And so I kind of, in my personal opinion, I think it's going to continue to evolve. While frameworks and the labels that we put on them might change, the mindsets and the principles and the objectives that we're still trying to drive towards, I think still apply, right? Regardless of the framework that you choose, regardless of which pieces of framework that you mix and match into a recipe that is going to have the most effective change for your team. And I think that's where, Don, you mentioned that, the term pragmatic. Being pragmatic, I think, is going to be so important in the evolution of business agility, because I don't think there's any one, golden hammer that works, for every single business agility or business transformation.
Yeah, our company is a good example of that, right? Improving's been around 14 years now, and I worked with the same people even before that for like 21 years now. And we've tried, a lot of what we do is just we'll build products for people, right? They'll say, hey, we've got this initiative, we don't have people, can you do it for us? And in those situations, often we get a say in how we're going to do it. And we've tried a lot of things over the years, from RUP to waterfall to RAD to lots of things, XP and Kanban. And the thing we kept coming back to is Scrum, not because it's on the cover of CIO magazine or anything like that. It's Scrum isn't the product we sell, right? But it's the best way we've been able to provide our customers with value. If something better came along, I hope we would jump ship. right? It's not about Scrum. We would pick it up in a heartbeat, but that's the thing is we're not tied to it. Nobody going through an agile transformation should be tied to any one framework. Like, let's experiment. Let's try something else. And as a product owner, well, the subtitle of my book, professional, is leveraging.
We couldn't quite see it. Yeah, there we go.
Leveraging Scrum as a competitive advantage, because as a product owner, I just took advantage of it. Is that, hey, now they're able to build something where there's value, or there's something that has potential value that works every sprint. So I could just sit on it, or maybe there's an advantage to our organization by just like testing it out in the marketplace. Maybe a small group of those. I don't can mitigate the risk, and so. Look, maybe Scrum won't be here in 10 years. Maybe we won't be using the word Scrum as much, but certainly cross-functional teams and testing and with the marketplace and building something, we're still going to be talking about that 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now. It's still going to be about people, right? So much of the things that make Agile successful are always going to be the case, right? People over-process. There'll never be a time where process will trump people. Unless the robots take over, right? Tools and processes become yeah.
We'll have to rewrite the Agile Manifesto when the robot uprising happens. Right? Yeah. Tools and techniques over people.
That's people a digital transformation gone too far.
Yes, careful with those digital transformations, even ending the world.
So, Allison, you've been a part of a ton of these. Where are you seeing it grow and change and morph in ways that you might not see?
I'm seeing more Kanban, more lean thinking getting folded in. You can also tell I've been watching, some like baking shows. So I'm very much like thinking like you fold it in. You don't want to like collapse it, collapse your Scrum and the accountabilities necessarily. But I actually think there's also some like really cool ideas being floated out there in the Agile community that I'm seeing, some experimentation with how do you bring in like open space principles as part of the adoption, right? And really create that invitation, open participation, folks can kind of go where their energy takes them. And that there's like a really strong learning culture that comes from that. Or some of the like mob programming kind of ideas that have, popped up that I think are rather exciting. And like, how does that start to shift the way that we get together and the way that we like focus on work and have discussions? So I know last week I was reading about Fast Agile, which is really incorporated more like dynamic reteaming and kind of this like larger, I think of it as like a Kanban view of the work that lets people self-organize into really short sprints to be able to like complete something, come back, big plan, and like kind of like ebb and flow of team formations. So things that go like this when I'm talking are always kind of cool.
Well,
definitely makes sense.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback right off of Allison on behalf of Lean and Kanban. I think where it's evolving big time is that flow of concept to cash, which brings in more of that systems thinking and all of us working together to figure out how do we shorten that gap between concept to cash, including innovation and all of that. I think that's that evolution. And I know, Don, you've said systems thinking for years and years and years, but if I could have folks catch one kind of shortcut, it would be to understand what that really means in their context and how that can really free us into looking at that value, if you will, from concept to cash and that systems thinking. So truly a kudos to you on that, Don, because like I say, that is something that you've said for years, but I think it takes a while for folks to really grasp. So if I can help anyone do that shortcut to pay attention to that sooner, I would suggest that.
Chris was one of our clients 14 years ago.
Yeah.
More than that, probably.
Yeah, more than that. Yeah, we've grown up together. Yes. Yeah.
So it's interesting because I almost see that concept to cash and that systems thinking space of trying to shorten idea to endpoint as the business reaction to almost a global movement to shorten idea to impact.
Yeah.
Whether that's from, social change, whether that's from, content, right? Shortening what's it take to go from idea to written to published has been shortening, right? There's this acceleration of the world that continues to shorten those cycles. And I think the kind of concept of cash and systems thinking might be the business response to that shortening of cycle. Because I don't know about y'all, but it feels like it moves much faster than it did 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And not by a little, like 3 or 4 times as fast.
In every industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which gets us to the question of like, okay, if it's going much faster and we're trying to do this quickly and we're trying to rev and we're trying to experiment, we're trying to deliver, how do we tackle the big things, right? Scaled Agile in whatever form it takes, whether it's safe, less, Nexus, DAD, sauce, whatever, is a hot topic. And the community is still pretty fractured, the same way the community was pretty fractured in the late 90s, early 2000s. What's your take on it? Like, where do you see the value? Where do you go, that's where I'm leaning in? Don, I know you've been a big part of the kind of evolution of Scrum and the growth of Nexus and the product owner stuff over the last 20 some odd years. What's your take? Where are you seeing this go for us?
Coming to be in this one. Yeah, well, yes, it is, and I think it's a needlessly complicated conversation. I think we have in our industry too much. I think the first thing is that we need to ask ourselves: do we even have a scaling problem? Like, we've worked with many large organizations that, when you really dig into it, you know, you've got lots of products, sure, but you know, you've got teams that are working on those products. The more we create dependencies between those teams, then I guess we need to complicate the way we architect ourselves and work together in our processes and stuff. But if we can clean up that a little bit, small teams working on products, and they're not working in the same things in the same space all the time, do we even have a scaling problem? Most of the organizations I see that are adopting a lot of these large scaling frameworks, they're really using it because they think it's a way to become agile. Right? It's got all these things and we install it and then we're agile. So they're not using it for scaling. They're using it for an unintended consequences of becoming agile. So they see it as an agile transformation framework, which, yes, there are, I mean, I think less and safe pieces of, so does DAD, I think now too, DA, I guess it's discipline agile, you know, of implementation roadmaps and stuff of getting there. But the reality is the vast majority do not need it. And I'm also seeing with our non-IT groups, even more so. With our non-IT groups, if you think about it, huge organizations, marketing department they're not all working in the same thing. They may have hundreds of people in their marketing department, but they've got lots of different marketing initiatives and small teams working on them, and they can minimize the dependencies between those. They may not need that level of complication. You know, there are layers, like SAFe brings the portfolio management layer and stuff that, you know, you could do portfolio management with anything. SAFe has, hey, here's some things to look at that could be helpful, but that's not a scaling issue either necessarily. That's which ones do we do first? You know, how do we allocate the right groups to the right initiatives, right? There's more to it than that, obviously, but anyways, that's what I'm going to leave it there, because I think we jump to this as a solution too quickly, and there's a lot of good things in all of them we could learn from, but don't expect it to be the transformation.
That's a very good point. I know, Chris, you've been kind of marching down the scaling path. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I agree. I would never recommend taking one framework and saying, this is it. It's taking bits and pieces and making a recipe. However, when one does that, you have to be careful not to cherry pick and make up something, because you still have guardrails. You still need to be within the boundaries, if you will, of the intent of different things. But weaving in my, again, my experience hands-on and the empathy for portfolio management, that's where I think, again, to Don's point, SAFe's really the only framework that's come out to say, here are some ideas in this space. I wish we had more of that, because I think when we can connect strategy to execution and really help with that mindset change of our investment strategies, bringing in that innovation, it changes how we measure value. I think that really shakes things up for a business transformation. So that's where I lean more into the frameworks that help us connect that execution and that strategy and execution. And again, that's how we can help to provide the leaders with what they want. Because I think, Don, you started out at the end of the day, we still have to track, scope, schedule, cost, whatever. We have investments, we have all of those things. But we want to do that in a manner that is very nimble, that is the ability to pivot or persevere, because businesses need to be agile, if you will, to stay competitive and relevant. And if anything, the last year we've seen that. So to the point, like Don said, it's a top of mind subject, but I would like folks to look at it openly and bring in the bits and pieces that make sense and have empathy to the bigger picture. Again, I'll weave in systems thinking. So
yeah, and I'll kind of give an example. So years ago, I worked with a large organization, had about 20 development teams all in the same code base. You very rarely encounter 20 teams in the exact same code base, but I think on the face of it, you could ask did they need scaling? Maybe not. We actually need to know more information. Back to what is their portfolio? What are the things that they need for their customers at that stage, at that moment in time as an organization? And that starts to determine, is scaling needed or not for those teams? So initially, the teams were, set up to kind of operate independently. We would look at the portfolio, ensure that there were not too many dependencies between the teams, and that you're able to get the most important things from a business perspective. And so there'd be the occasional, we might not be able to pick up that particular feature because of, other downstream vendors that we rely on, and that it's too much work in progress for them at one time, but we could manage it. Well, at some point in time, their business changes. They go through a really large acquisition. They start seeing some different mandates coming from the government. The portfolio now and where the bulk of the work is merger, integration type stuff and some compliance things. These teams needed to show a different kind of agility at that point in time because the portfolio revealed it. So then they start having to collaborate more closely with one another. They are going to be working in tighter and tighter areas of that code base, and they have to be more intimately familiar with it. So the level of communication needed, the visibility between teams changed at that point. And then as they continue to evolve, the business continues to change, their customer needs continue to change. They are able to move more firmly into independent products, and the teams are now trying to figure out, architecturally, how do you take out pieces of the architecture, pieces of that code base that I can be autonomous and I can have that nimble agility that I really want, so I can best serve my customers on a daily basis. So I don't think there's ever a blanket answer. It's always at that point in time, what is it you're trying to do? What do your customers need? What's the best approach for it?
I think, just building on that, Allison, I think you made a good point about just being nimble and being pragmatic with the approach. I think the majority of conversations I've even had on my current client that have to do with scaling, as I dig into them more and more, you start hearing more things that are along the lines of, I just need to be able to see all the work. I need more transparency. I need more visibility of, all the things that we're funding and so on. And it's almost like there's this constant battle where, product owners and Scrum teams are focused on their product backlogs and how do we feed that with user and stakeholder input and so on. But then as you go up the chain of the organization, it's more like, hey, I'm accountable for this $2 to $3 million, investment that we're making. I need to see some return on that. Where are we at, right? And I think in some respects, scaling, a lot of scaling frameworks might provide some of the governance frameworks, if you will, to open up some of that. I think this is where I think my personal take on it is you can often get into some of those conversations and say, hey, well, maybe a Scrum team just needs to figure out what level of detail they need to make transparent to you, right? Maybe they don't need to throw all their user stories and tasks and specific pieces in your face, right? Maybe it's what are the epics or the features, the larger level initiatives that might be speaking a little bit more of the language of the business leaders to say, here's the outcomes, the business outcomes you expected on your investment. Here's how we're progressing towards them. Here's some of the blockers and so on. Sometimes that sort of stuff actually maybe solves the need for some of that without the need to throw on a heavy scaling framework, right? I mean, even in this particular area that I was coaching, we did inject some pieces of the PI planning concept and even having a portfolio backlog. And it wasn't because this was 10 teams that work on one massive product and can pull different large pieces of functionality or anything like that. It was more because they were 10 teams that were all funded under one big FM. And it was really important for them to all interact and understand the business objectives, start talking to each other for lessons learned and things like that. But for the most part, they didn't have a ton of dependencies, but we did find pieces of, PI planning and a portfolio backlog that really just helped with systems thinking, communication. How do all of these tools fit into a bigger picture, right? And how can we actually collaborate on those? And so I think sometimes with scaling, it's diving in a little bit more and understanding what's the intent, and are there pieces of this that might solve that intent?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily a full-blown implementation all the time that might be costly and have a lot of overhead.
So this dovetails nicely. You've all mentioned pieces of a conversation that, because we're Agile nerds, Don and I were having at 9 p.m. last night. And so we've hit on metrics and measurements and business outcomes and all that. And I've heard everything over the last, 2 decades of everything from infinite transparency, right? Like the product owner should have everything. The VPs should see everything, to the, you got to be careful because there's a systemic lack of trust. You don't want to share something without context. They're going to use it to beat us up. Like, what are the right metrics? We get this question all the time. When I'm bringing a team, when I'm bringing a program, or I'm bringing an organization along that Agile journey, what are the right measures? And Don, this is a space that I know you've been talking about for years. I think I still use your spreadsheet. What are the right measures?
Yeah, and so, this is the classic consulting question that we like to ask is, how will you know when this is successful, right? And with Agile transformations, adaptations, whatever you want to call it these days, that's a tough question. We ask that a lot, and I mean, more often than not, we get answers like, and somebody say when 80% of our people achieve this certification. I had a CIO answer that question once by saying when everybody's trained in doing Scrum, and so that's obviously that's not what we're investing in. Like, are you really investing $1 million or whatever it's costing you this year on training and coaching and all that stuff to get people doing Scrum? Is that the end goal? So we have to move away from that, and I think it starts at the top. Like, how do we justify this expense? Use it like any initiative. What do you hope to achieve from it? What's the ROI? What's the business case from this? And I've had success going with at the executive level saying, what are your objectives this year? Usually they have some short-term objectives. Here's our 5-year vision or 3-year vision, and here's our goals this year. How do you think agility is going to help? Well, let's start there. So if it's better customer satisfaction, then okay, let's make a case for that. Like, it's my job as a coach, consultant, to say to link them. Say, here's the hypothesis. If we did Agile in these areas, then the customers will be happier because, I don't know, they're getting stuff more often. They're more involved. Or if it's lower costs, or I had a big company say our number one thing is quality. It's gone way down. Quality. That's it. That's all I want to know. This year is only about quality. That's all I care about. So, okay, let's start there. Because what we can't have is when somebody says, why are we doing this again? And management says, I don't know, it's just, don't you know, it's the strategic direction this year. That's what we're doing. Everybody's doing this. It's because the C-level wants it. They've got to be singing from the same songbook. So let's come up with what that is, link it to organizational objectives, and then let's test that hypothesis. As we're doing this and we're seeing people implementing these things, what are we seeing change in the organization, in the business? So that's anywhere from, it's got customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction is a good one too. We want happier people. Attrition's a real thing these days, and we want to change that. And this is a worthwhile investment for us in the organization. Time to market, innovation. Like there's a whole slew of things we can cover in that sense. But we've got to make that. Everybody up and down the organization needs to have the same answer when asked that. And that's what we measure.
And if I can just piggyback quickly on that, I think that's so critical because that brings in that engagement of leaders and that learning journey. Because I think part of changing the metrics from outputs to outcomes, you have to learn what that means. And you go through a maturity kind of journey on that. And I think that's a big part of it, because if we jump from, the outputs of the standard, percent complete to outcomes, there's a lot of in between there. And so if we can help leaders to understand what those metrics mean, why they're considered outputs compared to outcomes, and help them grow along that, that helps tremendously. Because I agree with you, Don, that it is, we got to make sure that we measure the right thing, but you have to scrub your brain and remap how you look at that. And I think that's where sometimes the leaders get lost, and they're in their comfy pair of shoes. And so we have to help them to see, now, if you ask this question, here's a response you're going to get back. And here's how it plays relevance into that new mindset. I think that is really helpful on that.
Chris, I was just kind of thinking, as you mentioned that about leaders, I think, where you can kind of almost see that trickle down is when leaders do have that mentality of like, we're going after outcomes. It's not about your velocity. It's not about how many tasks you finished, or et cetera, right? We're trying to get quicker concept to cash, as you mentioned earlier. I think what you then start seeing, and where you really start seeing a lot of effects, is when teams start feeling like that's their measure of success as well, right? And understanding that, hey, I'm not just going to be measured if my velocity, my success isn't just on if my velocity went up, it's if we actually had a successful outcome out of what we're trying to accomplish, right? And I think oftentimes there's a disconnect between those two, and that's what leads to some confusion. I mean, even, in one of the areas that I've worked in quite recently, the team that I'm working with is like a more traditional IT team, if you will, and they're more responsible for installing LTE, Wi-Fi networking at just all of their sites across the globe. And what they found was they were reporting to all these really pretty Power BI dashboards and ADO dashboards and et cetera about all of their outputs, right? Like, here's our percentage complete and et cetera. And then when I went and talked to the senior leader who was kind of more responsible for like funding all of this and so on, she just said, everybody just keeps bringing me these dashboards. And when I ask how far are we on this Asia Pac, networking implementation, nobody can answer the question. But to her, that's what was valuable, right? And I think that's where we have to figure out a way to make those two things intersect.
You've hit on something that I find interesting, is the expansion of agility outside of IT, right? We had this problem in IT, and still do to this day, of the expert bias, right? We want to be perceived as the expert. And so saying I don't know, saying I need to experiment is scary. and so for 30 odd years, we've been using Scrum and similar frameworks to try and teach that it's okay not to know, as long as we know how we're going to know. But then you start expanding it into places where that expert bias is even greater, right? Your PhD geophysicist, your 30-year financial trader, right, who's been doing financial instrument engineering. And you start getting into those places that we're going to get it wrong is a little scary. And we typically promote our top level experts to become our managers, to become our leaders. How do we overcome that? How do we overcome we don't know, right? We're the chief experimentation group rather than we're your expert guides and there will be no failure. Allison, how have you seen that overcoming that barrier?
I feel like the easiest trick in the book is to now frame it as risk mitigation, right? Every expert knows there are still some areas where things could go wrong. We could like facilitate that pre-mortem conversation, and then, try to work with them of like, great. So, what is that like smaller chunk, and how can we validate? How can we confirm? And take it from that approach is often my go-to, I guess I would say.
That's a pretty solid go-to. So we are coming up on our time box. And as we conclude today, I wanted to kind of get your 60-second take on what's next for business agility. Like a year from now, what are the successes we're going to be celebrating as an industry? So starting with you, Don, what do you see? What's the next hill we're going to conquer?
I guess I see it. I've been asked this a lot of times, and I think about it a lot. And what keeps coming back to me is I had an executive once ask me, "How will we know when we're agile?" And then it quickly through my mind in that moment, I went through like all the different things the endeavors I've been a part of or around that Improving's been a part of. And I thought about all our clients. And then I said, and this may not be the best endorsement, I said, could I pick one of those to say they are now agile? Like they're there now, they've arrived. And then I'm like, I realized that I can't. At no point can I say this. You want an agile company? This is the agile company. Maybe some startup or whatever, but not in mid-sized to large company. And then I start realizing, and this is what I ended up saying to him. It's like, you won't know. And that's probably maybe that realization is coming down the pike. Is that the agile is literally a set of values, right? It's a value system, 4 values and 12 principles from the Agile Manifesto. So the best you can do is I think is just you've got a value and you're moving towards it. Like I value the value of respect. I want to be a more respectful person. Have I achieved it? Is there a certain point in my life where the switch went? I'm like, I've achieved it. Hooray, respect party, right? No, and I never will. But it's the journey, right? If I look back now, and we rarely do this, is pause and look back at how much of the mountain we've climbed. You know, I would never go back. Am I more respectful than the Don 5 years ago? Absolutely, I would hope. I'm a bit more of a curmudgeon, but no, it is. So, and I think that's what we're seeing. Like if we ask any of our clients, are they agile? They'll go, no. But would you go back to the way you were 5 years ago? Well, no, heck no. There's no way. And I think that realization has to get out there. Is that this isn't a switch. This is why the word transformation gets me a little. It's like we don't go into our little cocoon and emerge a beautiful agile butterfly on the other side. So that's kind of, I know it's not an answer to that, but because it's not like there's going to be some big thing, and it's just it's a journey, and the more we look at it like other values like trust and respect and kindness, I think the better off we all are.
Fantastic. Chris, how about you?
I was going to say, I'll go a little bit more tactical out of a risk of that. I would like to see us really making a difference in demand matching capacity. I think if we can really get something around that to help folks out, that way they can, again, get that good life balance and that kind of back to the principles and so on. And that then is also leading into using more objective data, really getting that round trip feedback loop and embracing the objectivity of data. And trying to separate the emotions that we bring into some of our things and looking at it, is this the right investment for internal and external things, and really focusing there. That's where I would like to see the next big kind of evolution happen. Yeah.
It's not your baby, it's your product.
Exactly. Yes.
So Allison, how about you?
I want to piggyback on Chris there. I think there's something to be said of like the joy of work. And I say that as like a total nerd, obviously, that like one of my hobbies is public speaking. It's how I've really like kind of grown up, I think professionally, that I want more workplaces adopting that learning culture. People are excited about the products that they work on. They are putting great things in the hands of customers because they feel the meaning behind it that, you know, Don alluded to previously. And that they're like, got this exciting story to tell, that then they like call me up and go, hey, will you mentor me? I want to speak at a conference. And I go, yes, absolutely. Let's do this.
Absolutely. And Vimal, why don't you round us out? What are you seeing?
Just, you know, what Don said about this being a journey, I think really resonated with me. I'm a big sports fan, and I think of just like a team that won the Super Bowl and they achieve their outcomes, and then they go back to the next season and it's a grind again, right? And it's almost like a similar, like I think what I see, like, where are we going to be in a year from now, especially as we expand more and more into business agility and other areas of the business. I think what I would really love to see is for the status quo to be challenged, for, you know, folks to feel like they've actually achieved outcomes and untapped potential that they hadn't seen before. And then to start understanding, okay, we've built a little bit of foundation here. Let's build on that critical mass, continue to evolve our cultures, get closer to the value and that we're trying to deliver and the people that we're trying to actually impact. And I think those are the things that, Allison, as you mentioned, just create just a more fun, exciting, agile, nimble place to work that people want to be a part of, right? People want to be a part of a place where they can actually feel the impact and the value that they're delivering, and actually see that in play. And I think that's just such a crucial part. And I think we're headed in that direction. Yeah, that's my take in 60 seconds at least.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all. This has been a great conversation. Thank you to everybody joining us on the panel, as well as those who joined the online stream. Have a great afternoon and hope to see you back.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a great weekend.